in the 6e4 section is a tactical beauty. Not completely sound, mind you, and we do have some suggestions for better ways for black to play the opening, but nonetheless a very interesting game. Maurizio Apatano, a master, is playing white against Boris Chatalbalchev, who is rated about 25 FIDE. So obviously a couple of very strong players. d4, g6, c4, bishop g7, knight c3, c5, d5, bishop takes c3, bc3, f5. White plays e4, and after f takes e4, plays queen c2. Now, of course, f3 is the main move, and we covered that rather extensively. We've also seen g4, which is a bit aggressive and weakens the white king side, and we also saw bishop to g5, as well as the slower paced knight e2. So here, white plays queen c2. And this is very tricky, because now when black plays a very natural knight to f6, white does very well to play f3. Less effective after knight f6 was bishop to h6, which was very nicely met by a similar maneuver to what we saw in my game with knight g4. After bishop g5 castles, again we see this combination of exploiting the weakness on f2. That game worked out quite well for black. After knight h3, d6, bishop e2, knight e5, queen takes e4, bishop h3, g takes h3, knight f6, white played the aggressive f4, only to discover that after knight f7, he could not capture on e7 due to the powerful rook e8, bishop d8, rook e4, bishop h4, rook at a to e8, simply winning the pinned piece on e2. A very familiar story. So in that game, after knight f7 castles, knight takes g5, fg5, knight e5, black stood clearly better, and it's absolutely amazing to me that white was able to draw this game in 33 moves. In fact, after rook f8 check, queen takes f8, I probably would have considered taking with the king. Why? Because after rook f8 check, then I save a tempo and I get my king up to g7, freeing my queen to come to either b6 or to a5 and begin operations. Of course, I'll probably want to play rook f8 at some moment just to offer the exchange of rooks. Anyway, coming back to our current game, black played knight f6, and white very astutely played f3. And exactly the problem that we see in the earlier variation, black played what I consider to be dubious, the queen a5, and after f takes e4, didn't want to go in for knight takes e4, so now played d6. So going back after f3, how should black play? Well, you have two choices here. Instead of queen a5, you could play d6, and after f takes e, play knight d7, and start to head for either the Roman barricade or the idea that I showed with knight e5. That would be one choice. The other choice would be after f3, would be to go ahead and play e5 anyway. White has a choice. White could either play f takes e4, and after d6, we then follow with queen to e7 to g7, and maybe knight d7, and so forth, with our plan of playing on the king side. White's other choice would be to take on e6, but then, after a move like queen e7, if pawn takes pawn, we get a similar position to what we saw before, and black has very good counterplay. Knight c6, this bishop can either go b6 and bishop to a6. The pawns on e4 and c4 are very weak. You know, black has good chances. But what I don't like is that after queen a5, fe4, d6, knight f3, black has managed to transpose into kind of a bad variation from what we saw before. After knight bd7 though, white should probably just go ahead and play bishop d3. Instead, white played bishop e2. Black decided to go in for complications now with knight takes e4, because of course queen e4, queen c3, king f2, queen a1, bishop g5. It looks impressive, the attack on the queen, the threat of mate on e7. However, with the calm, cool, and collected queen g7, black solves both problems and maintains his material advantage. He is now ready to play knight f6 and maybe even castle kingside. So going back after knight e4, bishop to d3. Black now has a difficult choice. Grabbing the c3 pawn, of course, with queen takes, knight takes, and bishop to b2 is not very appetizing. The other choice, retreating the knight, after bishop d3, retreating the knight back to f6, castles, and white has a very dangerous attack. For example, knight g4 is already met by bishop g6, hg6, queen g6, king d8, and queen g4 with a pretty overwhelming advantage for white. So after bishop d3, black rose to the occasion, in a matter of speaking, and played knight to f6, reinforcing the knight on e4. And here, white played a very interesting and unusual move, bishop to b2, which of course is absolutely ugly from a positional point of view, but from a tactical point of view, it's quite astute, because it protects the pawn on c3, thus leaving the knight on e4 rather trapped with no retreat. Black reinforces his knight with bishop to f5, and here white castled, which in principle is a good idea. However, he misses a moment to lash out with g4 and undermine the black piece configuration with bishops and knights. After bishop takes g4, bishop takes e4, black has basically lost a piece. In the game though, after castles, black castles, white plays rook at a to e1, and now black played what we used to call in college a confusionary riff. Once you realize the situation is very difficult, you look for the best possibility for confusing the opponent. And black played e5, figuring that white would play g4 and try to trap his piece, which in fact is what happened. After e5 though, white should simply call black's bluff and use that tricky French en passant rule and capture on e6. After a move like rook at a to e8, now white should go in for the complications with g4 and collecting a piece. After bishop g4, bishop e4, rook e6, white can even venture with bishop takes g6 with a crushing attack. For example, rook e1, knight takes e1, hg6, queen g6, king h8, rook f6, rook takes, queen takes, and white will also come and collect the bishop on c4. But in the game, e5, white rushed now to win the piece with g4, but after bishop g4, bishop e4, knight e4, the white knight on f3 is attacked twice. Thus, queen takes e4 was necessary, but now rook f4, and suddenly we see the point of e5 is that black now has the f4 base for his pieces to operate on. After queen e3, the white queen needs to stay close to defend the knight. Queen a2, and suddenly things are not so bad for black. He actually has 3 pawns for the piece, an open file and an active bishop and an active queen, and a weak pawn on c4 as usual to attack. Note that the attack is also on the bishop, so after bishop c1, bishop h3, the white rook on f1 is under pressure. White now throws in rook e2, attacking the queen. Black plays queen takes c4, collecting a 4th pawn for his piece, and after rook at f to f2, rook at a to f8. Black now has total control of the f-file, a fantastic bishop, closing in very close on the white king, an active queen, 4 pawns, and the pawn on d5 is weak as well. White now played knight d2, hoping that the discovered attack on the bishop and the attack on the queen would net some material. However, this is the moment in the game I like. Black played rook takes on f2. The point being that if knight c4, rook f1 check is mate. After rook takes f2, rook takes f2, queen g4 check, white had had enough. The simple point being that if queen g3, queen d1 check, knight f1, the beautiful queen takes f1 check, rook takes, and rook takes f1 with a pure rook plus bishop mate. Okay, let's do a quick recap. After f takes e4, white introduced queen c2. Black played the very flexible knight f6, protecting the pawn on e4, and now white astutely played f3. Here, black fell into a bad transposition and played queen a5. Again, I would prefer either d6 or e5. In both cases, keeping the queen close to the king side because action is happening in the center. Nonetheless, after queen a5, fe4, d6, knight f3, we've fallen into a variation where the black queen is a bit offsides in my view. Black at this point, instead of playing knight to g4 and heading for the Roman barricade, now played knight takes e4, the speculative grab of a pawn, and after bishop d3, reinforced his knight with knight at d to f6. And here, white played the very beautiful but very ugly bishop to b2. It's ugly from a positional point of view, but it's beautiful from a tactical point of view because it leaves the black knight on e4 stranded. At this point, black is in trouble. He reinforced his knight with bishop to f5, and here white missed the first opportunity with g4 to undermine the whole configuration and obtain a decisive advantage. Instead, white castled, and after black castled, white played rook at a to e1, which was also quite effective. Again applying more pressure on the trapped knight on e4. Black played the confusing looking e5, and white, instead of taking pawn takes pawn en passant, again with a decisive advantage, followed by rook at a to e8 and then g4, white played, after e5, the immediate g4. Black then was able to show his stuff with bishop takes g4, knight e4, knight e4, note the double attack on f3, and after queen e4, rook f4, and suddenly black had fantastic activity for his sacrificed piece. In fact, after queen e3, queen takes a2, he had a double attack on the bishop and the pawn on c4. After the bishop retreated, bishop h3, rook e2, queen c4, black already had 4 pawns for the piece. And after rook f2 and rook at a to f8, black had fantastic play on the f-file. White tried knight d2, hoping that the double attack with the knight on the queen and the queen on the bishop would yield some material. Unfortunately, black played the very alert rook takes f2, offering his queen because knight takes c4 is obviously met by rook f1 mate. So after knight d2, rook takes f2 was unpleasant news for white. After the recapture rook f2, queen g4, white had no choice but to resign, since queen g3 allows queen d1 check, knight f1, queen takes f1, rook takes f1, and rook takes f1 with a beautiful checkmate finish. Thank you.